now, that Oscar-winning rabbit, Bugs Bunny.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight the question is, what makes an animated cartoon? How do we make a move? Well, first of all, you gotta have a script. And in animated cartoons, this is what we call a script. Then we have to have voices. What's the name of that guy who does all those voices?
Mel Blanc. Capital M, capital E, capital L, Blanc.
Oh yeah, Mel Blanc. He wouldn't want it publicized, folks, but actually, I do Mel Blanc's voice.
There was a time, believe it or not, when the name Mel Blanc was synonymous with Bugs Bunny and the Looney Tunes. And sometimes we forget how much time has passed since the classic WB characters were voiced by someone other than Mel. But to put it into perspective, Mel's not the only guy to do the voices that has passed on. Just last year, we lost the giant talent of Joe Alaskey, probably the best guy for doing specific voice actor recreations and not just creating a similar voice to an existing character. More on this great talent later. Growing up in the late 70s and 80s, Mel Blanc was almost as visible as his animated counterparts, appearing in commercials, fundraisers, and even The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. After the animation department closed in the early 60s, Mel wasn't doing the voices of the classic Looney Tunes characters as often. You see, Warner Brothers cartoon animation wasn't made at Warner Brothers for about 20 years. All those classic WB cartoons we grew up loving on TV and Saturday morning were originally made for theaters, to go before newsreels and movies. And once the theatrical short subject died, there was no more need to have an in-house animation department anymore. So Mel went to work at other studios, like Hanna-Barbera, but whenever WB needed Looney Tunes, he was there. We've all seen them, the TV specials, the cereal commercials, and in one case, the big screen. But for this video, we're going to take a look at the less obvious stuff. What's up, Docs and Docettes? Welcome to an all-new Looney Tunes Critic video, and this one is all about Mel Blanc, and more specifically, the stuff he did as the classic Warner Brothers characters, but outside of the studio. And some of these performances were done while the theatrical shorts were still in production, some of it after. The other thing to note is that I'm going to try and give these performances some kind of order, so let's put them in order from least to greatest in terms of obscurity. So without any further ado, here are the top 5 non-Warner Brothers Mel Blanc Looney Tunes performances. Number 5, Who Framed Roger Rabbit? This movie is number 5 on the list because, while it's easily the best thing on this list, although that's really not saying much, I mean, Roger Rabbit is the best thing on a lot of people's lists. I mean, after all, it's a perfect movie. But it is also the least obscure. Everyone knows this picture. I mean, Roger was made at a very interesting time in animation history, and Mel's death happened right in the middle of an era where traditional animation was experiencing a resurgence. And there was now, once again, reason for Warner Brothers to have an active animation department. Some of his last performances as the characters was for Greg Ford, who directed him in, among other things, a new Daffy short, a commercial here and there, and a direct-to-video called Daffy Duck's Quackbusters, which would turn out to be Mel's last of the Looney Tunes anthology movies. In fact, Mel's death was so untimely that when this original commercial that he voiced for the Warner Brothers catalog in 1987 needed some updates for the Batman VHS release, they had to use Jeff Bergman because Mel had unfortunately passed away by then.
Just in for this. A free Warner Brothers catalog. Just in for this. A new Warner Brothers catalog.
Now, I did just mention that Mel died at the height of an animation resurgence, and the Kickstarter for that resurgence was Who Framed Roger Rabbit. So let's talk about Mel's performances in that movie. He did Bugs, Daffy, Tweety, and Porky. Now, I know some of you are saying, hey, what about Yosemite Sam? Yosemite Sam's in that movie. Get your facts straight. And while I do applaud you combating misinformation by yelling at a device, I thought of that. Clip. See there? Right in the credits. Says right there, Mel did not do Sam. This was the first time that Joe Alasky was hired to recreate a classic Looney Tunes voice.
He says I haven't been this close to Toontown for a while.
Ow! My biscuits are burning! Fire in the hatch! Oh, green hornet toads, that's smarts!
Mel did try to record Sam for the movie, but this was around 1987 or 88, and by this time, he hadn't been doing Yosemite Sam for quite a while, as a matter of fact. It wasn't easy for him.
Yosemite Sam, they showed me he was a little cowboy, and he was only 2 feet tall with long red hair and had to be recognized, so I had to give him a recognizable voice.
So I gave a real loud voice, like so. My name's Yosemite Sam.
This is one that almost gets me every time I use it.
He would do a few lines as Sam here and there for like promotional things, but never again for an entire cartoon. Even Maurice LaMarche, who voiced Sam for that show Wabbit, had to give up doing the show because he encountered the same problem that Mel did.
I know from reading about Mel Blanc doing Yosemite Sam, he would schedule, they were nice to him, they would schedule Yosemite Sam as the last character on a Friday.
Friday, so he had the weekend.
Because he had the weekend, he needed the weekend.
And I carried that through.
Yeah.
I carried that forth on the show Wabbit. And it's not a knock on anybody there. They couldn't schedule it on Fridays. So we recorded on Tuesdays. And I did the character for the first season, and it was killing me. And I was showing up like this, which is not what the voice is.
No.
And I'd sometimes have to take 2 or 3 days off. So last year I actually had to walk away from the character. But all loves Yosemite Sam, and all misses him.
So Mel was indeed asked to provide the voice for Sam, and he gave it a shot, but it wasn't really happening, and the engineers eventually told him, I think out of politeness, that they would be able to work with that. They then got Joe Alasky to provide that yell that Sam does in the final movie, the "My biscuits are burning," that whole thing. And if you feel like a sucker for being fooled, don't. Remember, folks, this is Joe Alasky we're talking about. The man was a master mimic. And he not only fooled me and you and so many others, but he even fooled Mel himself. Yeah, Mel saw the movie and reportedly turned to the person next to him and said, wow, they did a great job with what I gave them. That's how good Joe Alasky was, folks. Even Mel Blanc thought Joe's Sam was his.
Steve, got a new line for Mel.
One of the more difficult aspects to pull off with Mel and his performance in Roger Rabbit is that the movie takes place in 1947, and for the most part, every character that wasn't created specifically for the movie appears as they did in the cartoons that they were in at the time. Except for Betty Boop, because towards the end of her run, she traded the cocktail dress in for something a little more respectable. But where would it be more appropriate to wear a cocktail dress than when she's actually serving cocktails?
Work's been kind of slow since cartoons went to color.
By the way, the movie got this part right, too. She actually hadn't been in a cartoon since 1939.
You still got it.
If the tunes are going to look classic, they have to sound classic, too. And even the great Mel Blanc can't be expected to sound as young and vibrant as he did 40 years before. So they sped his voice up a little bit, which is fine for Bugs, but the other 3 characters he did for that movie, Tweety, Porky, and Daffy, they were sped in the original shorts. They were all pitched up by 3 semitones back in 1947, which presents a problem. If you have to speed Mel's voice up to make him sound like how Bugs did in the 40s, a voice that was never classically pitched up, then how much do you pitch up the voices that were traditionally pitched back in 1947? Well, it's not easy to figure out. Remember, kids, this is the pre-digital world. You couldn't just dial in a Mel Blanc pitch plugin in Pro Tools. In fact, everything with those 3 characters, including Speedy Gonzales, that was produced after the studio closed in the 60s, had the potential to get those voices wrong. More on that phenomenon later.
This is the last time I work with someone with a speech impediment. This is the last time I work with someone with a speech impediment.
But getting Mel's voice to sound right in Roger Rabbit is worth noting, because it was not easy with the information available at the time, and getting it right showed a level of respect that even Warner Brothers hadn't always maintained then. Proof of that is, Daffy actually sounds like Daffy in the sequence of the Ink and Paint Club, but in stuff that Warner Brothers did the same year as Roger Rabbit, Daffy sounds less like Daffy and more like Mel Blanc with a lateral lisp.
Does anybody understand what this duck is saying?
This so-called miniature elephant couldn't possibly exist.
See, that is the mark of quality that is Who Framed Roger Rabbit, ladies and gents. It was the reason for the animation resurgence of the late 80s and early 90s, and it was largely because of Steven Spielberg. Granted, the real beginning of that era began with Ralph Bakshi's Mighty Mouse, but hey, who's counting? Not just Roger Rabbit itself, but Spielberg is the reason Warner Brothers Animation came back at all. If you loved Tiny Toons, Tasmania, Animaniacs, Pinky and the Brain, Batman the Animated Series, Superman the Animated Series, Freakazoid, Hysteria, the Tweety and Sylvester Mysteries, or Duck Dodgers by extension, then my friend, you owe Steven Spielberg a debt of gratitude. It was the first and last time a Hollywood director used his clout to force an entire studio to shell out the necessary cash beyond TV animation budgets, which, by the way, are almost always minuscule, to pay homage to the classic Warner Brothers cartoon standard. Again, unless you count Bakshi's Mighty Mouse. In fact, it's times like these that I deeply wish that J.J. Abrams had been weaned as a boy on theatrical and classic animation and not stupid f***ing Star Wars. Anyway, number 4. The records.
Greetings. My name is Daffy. There's no other duck like me, because I'm so daffy. And the reason I'm daffy, and so gosh darn riff-raffy, and so screwy and laughy, is because those hunters won't leave me alone.
So this category is a little bit strange. See, Mel put out records, or at least 45 singles, and in certain songs he would portray one or more of the Looney Tunes characters. The two most popular, or at least the most well-known today, are Daffy's Rhapsody, a song where the little black duck laments that hunters are after him to the tune of Hungarian Rhapsody, and I Taught a Putty Tat, a song where Tweety Pie and Sylvester lament their chase-based relationship. The reason it's a little bit strange? Because these records were put out by Capitol. Remember, this list is cataloging Mel's Looney Tunes character performances outside of Warner Brothers. At that time, Capitol Records apparently had greater faith in Mel, if not the cartoon voices he portrayed, because they had a license then that allowed them to use both the Warner Brothers characters and the Walter Lantz characters. And let's not forget, Lantz's greatest cartoon character was another Blanc vocal creation, Woody Woodpecker. By the way, remember how I was saying that it wasn't always easy in the 70s and 80s to pitch the tape of Mel's vocals to sound accurate? Well, imagine how hard it was in the 40s when they didn't even use tape. Granted, magnetic tape had been invented about 10 years prior, but it wasn't being used to make cartoons yet. But yeah, check out this record of Mel performing as Woody with a singing group called The Sportsmen for Capitol, if not Capital, and see if you can hear what I mean by getting the pitch wrong.
I pick a few holes in a tree to see if a redwood's really red. It's nothing to me to fly off my tree and peck a few holes in your head.
That's the Woody Woodpecker's tune.
The interesting thing to note about Woody's laugh is that it's so iconic, and yet Mel only did Woody's voice for the first 2 cartoons before he signed an exclusive deal to Leon Schlesinger, the man who was producing the Warner Brothers cartoons at the time. However, in most cases, regardless of who's doing the voice, the laugh is still Mel. It's taken from those first 2 cartoons. It's kind of like how every time you hear the Roadrunner doing the beep beep and something current, it's not somebody new doing the voices. It's actually taken from one of the original voice sessions with background painter Paul Julian. Paul Julian was a background painter at Warner Brothers at the time, and the reason that he used to do that, he'd be, have a stack of background paintings, and he had to get them upstairs, and people be lingering in the hallway, had to get by. So that's where that comes from. Bonus thing you didn't know. Now, of course, Warner Brothers has the rights to at least 2 of those Mel Blanc records, the aforementioned Daffy's Rhapsody and I Taught Putty Tat, which they had to do for the CGI animated theatrical shorts. And it's worth mentioning once again the great Joe Alasky. Warner Brothers acquired the original recordings and cleaned them up so that Mel's vocals could be used again, but they encountered a problem when it came time to animate Putty Tat. There were several times where Sylvester plummets or gets hurt and needs to make sounds of pain, but of course, Mel didn't record those sounds because they weren't needed for a record. So Joe Alasky once again was called in to save the day.
I did. I drew a Woody as plain as he could be.
I am that great big bad old cat. Sylvester is my name.
Again, that's just how good Joe Alasky was, folks. You could put his Sylvester next to Mel's Sylvester and not suspect a thing. In fact, if you've ever watched an episode of The Honeymooners, there's a very good chance you're actually hearing Joe Alasky. There were a number of episodes of The Honeymooners that hadn't been properly preserved, and by the early 80s, the soundtrack was unusable in certain places, and several lines by Jackie Gleason had to be replaced. But by that time, Gleason's voice didn't have the same timbre that it once did, and so Alasky was brought in to replace the lines. Again, he's so good that you can hear his voice right next to the original and be none the wiser. Rest in peace, Joe. You are dearly missed. Number 3, radio appearances. Okay, yes, haha, no one has ever appeared on radio. Very funny. Thank you, joke from vaudeville. But part of the reason that Mel was so good at acting with just his voice is that back during the golden age of animation, there was an entire other booming industry that required such a performer, an actor who could evoke not one but multiple characters with different looks, ideals, and motivations, all from their vocal performance. And that industry was live radio. Radio is one of those industries where you can absolutely say that the more things change, the more they stay the same. I've worked briefly in radio myself, and making the distinction between radio and live radio was never more prudent than now. With more than 90% of the human voices and interaction you hear on the dial now, all of it phony. If you want real people on the mic in real time now, you need satellite radio. Also, there's no money in it. I thought my paycheck was minuscule because I hadn't gotten my radio machine operator's license yet, but it was actually because I never had any interest in medicine or the law. My mentor, Stan Priest, once told me that if I have any desire to save money, don't get into radio. And that was in 1999. But Mel said the same thing of radio himself. He said, if you work really hard in radio for years and years and years, eventually they let you do it for free. Anyway, Mel was a regular on Burns and Allen as Mr. Postman, plus himself and a plethora of other as-needed characters on the Jack Benny program. He even had his own radio show with his wife, The Mel Blanc Show, and very often the worlds of those radio shows would cross paths with Mel's ties to Warner Brothers Animation. The most obvious example would be 1959's The Mouse That Jack Built, directed by Robert McKimson. This came about because Benny had seen a previous McKimson cartoon called The Honeymousers, itself an obvious yet well-made parody of the previously mentioned Honeymooners. Benny's only condition was that he be given a 16mm print of the finished cartoon, which he received. Second most obvious would be another McKimson short, 1947's, there's that year again, Easter Yeggs, where Mel employed his depressive Mr. Postman voice from Burns and Allen for an equally depressed, if not questionably homosexual, Easter Bunny.
I'm the Easter Rabbit, and I'm supposed to be happy and gay.
But again, this video isn't about the stuff he did for Warner Brothers. It's about the stuff that Mel did outside of the studio. All throughout Mel's radio and cartoon career, he maintained a close personal friendship with Jack Benny. These two comedy icons were such good friends that very often they would break each other up. Jack never broke except when he was with Mel, and Mel never broke except when Jack would change the script on him.
Hey, what are you doing now?
I'm the voice of Bugs Bunny. I got you, but that...
So you gave up that lousy fiddle, huh?
Yes, I gave it up. Get out.
So because of their great affection for one another, it should come as no surprise that one of the best examples of Mel doing one of the Looney Tunes voices on radio away from Warner Brothers is on the Jack Benny program. Here now is a clip from an episode of the Jack Benny program, aka the Lucky Strike program starring Jack Benny, an episode called Jack Goes to the Doctor for a Vitamin Shot, and originally aired on November 7th, 1954.
Look, nurse, I haven't got much time. I want to see Dr. Stevens.
Well, he's busy now. You'll have to wait. Sit over there by that gentleman in the corner.
Oh, is his appointment ahead of mine?
Oh, he's not waiting to see Dr. Stevens. He has an appointment with our psychiatrist.
Psychiatrist? He isn't violent, is he?
Oh, far from it. In fact, he's very gentle. He thinks he's a rabbit.
Come on, Mary, let's sit down.
Jack, what are you so mad about?
That smart aleck nurse trying to kid me, a rabbit. Man looks just as normal as I do.
Jack, there isn't room for both of us to sit on the sofa.
Yes, there is, Mary. I'll ask him to move over. Pardon me, sir.
What's this, Jack?
Say, you really do think you're a rabbit?
Yeah.
Where do you live?
Oh, I have a nice little hutch in Brentwood.
Mary, move over. Tell me, mister, did you always think you were a rabbit?
No. Up until last week, I thought I was a turkey.
Up until last week, eh? What made you stop being a turkey?
Well, it's so close to Thanksgiving, they turned me down for life insurance.
Oh.
I want a double indemnity.
I see.
With cranberry sauce.
Well, that's the only way to have it. Anyway, maybe you're better off being a rabbit.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait any longer for that psychiatrist. Bye, Doc.
Do you know me? I'm an important Warner Brothers star, but I'm not always recognized. Watch it, Buster. That's why I wear this, my Warner Brothers t-shirt. With it, people see me for the star I am. Good morning, Mr.
I
Duck.
have your autograph, Mr. Duck.
Oh, hey, you're my favorite duck.
Now you can own the same t-shirt and enjoy the same popularity. Just call this number and they'll send you a t-shirt for just $9.95. With your shirt, you'll also get a free catalog of Warner Brothers and Looney Tunes stuff, like movie posters, mugs, and director's chairs. So don't leave home without calling and ordering. Oh, that's Daffy! Daffy Duck! I can't believe you'd mistake a big star like me for that other duck who can't even talk straight!
For your Warner Brothers t-shirt and catalog, call toll-free 1-800-2-WARNER.
Don't forget to call, folks.
Number 2, Daffy Duck and Porky Pig meet the Groovy Ghoulies.
Oh, no! You'll have to catch me first.
Man, the little brats run away to Mad Mirrorland.
I know. I don't even know where to start with this one, guys. I mean, this...
Come on! Yeah, man! Come back with my guitar!
Hey, wait for me!
I mean, I don't know if it's as bad as Space Jam, but I mean, it's certainly comparable. Because, like Space Jam, it confirms my theory that anytime the Looney Tunes are shown together at all, or anytime they have to work together as a team, it's bad. Because Warner's was the animation studio in the old days that focused most on character. In fact, every studio back in the day had their own thing. Fleischer's was all about technique and pushing the envelope. Disney's was all about having the best quality of animation. Lance had Woody. Terry Toons had craziness with, they were just unhinged with the animation of Jim Tyre. And MGM had the best gag cartoons, specifically because of Tex Avery and all his brilliance and the Hanna-Barbera guys doing the Tom and Jerry's. So the backlash of being the studio with all the best, the most interesting characters in your arsenal is that it all starts to fall apart when you get more than 3 of them in a room together, because then you have to write around the fact that other than the circumstances at hand, these characters would never interact with each other, and otherwise would just eventually wander off back to their own corners of existence. So, what is it about? What is Daffy Duck and Porky Pig Meet the Groovy Ghoulies about? Well, for starters, it's about 20 minutes too long. I know, bad joke, right? Well, it's not really a bad joke so much as a palate cleanser, because you're not going to get anything that funny from this picture, you guys. You'll see what I mean. This thing was produced by Filmation, a studio that employed way more than anyone's fair share of literal-minded idiots, gave them creative job titles, and for the next 15 years, animation on television was completely awful. So the Groovy Ghoulies, which according to Wikipedia was a show once, a spin-off of the Sabrina the Teenage Witch show, itself a spin-off of the Archie show, which I guess is why some of the characters have those Bob Montana eyes. And this particular venture was a 1-hour special made for the ABC Saturday Superstar movie in 1972. The special starts with the Ghoulies watching TV in Horrible Hall, which is the name of their boarding house, but it may as well be the name of the Filmation writer's room. So they're watching TV in Horrible Hall, their haunted castle. Yeah, don't you love that? This was a time in television where they loved to marry the fantastic with the mundane, but it's just so stupid. It's like, you're undead, you live in a castle, you can cast spells, you're made up of dead human parts, and yet you're still sitting around watching TV. I don't know, maybe they were a Nielsen family, who knows? Or Addams family. Anyway, while they're sitting there watching the Daffy Duck show, they learn of Daffy making a new movie about King Arthur because of a news bulletin that interrupts the show. Because that happens, yeah. I mean, that's like if you're watching Home Improvement, I guess this would be in the 90s, and you're just sitting there and then all of a sudden there's like a news bulletin interrupting to tell you that Tim Allen is making the Santa Claus. My point in relaying this is that it's totally realistic.
Because my mommy's name was Arthur.
Hey, what happened? They can't do that to Daffy.
Man, just when they were getting to the grooviest part. Maybe it's a commercial for vanishing cream.
Hello, cartoon fans. I'm the dreaded Phantom of the Flickers. You can forget about ever seeing any more cartoons, because I plan to destroy every frame of film Daffy Duck and his friends ever made.
So a ghoul named the Phantom of the Flickers interrupts the broadcast or something like that, and threatens to steal not just Daffy's movie, but all the old ones we loved as kids. Now there's a ton that I could say here, like, a metaphor about Filmation destroying animation's legacies, but it's like I think you get it.
I don't care whom he is. I've been Daffy's biggest fan ever since the day I was assembled. I'm going to Hollywood and give him...
Frankie says he's worried about Daffy, but he shouldn't be. What Frankie should be saying, at least according to history, is relax. Because unlike him, Daffy still has a career, despite having one of the first sex tape scandals in Hollywood. So the Ghoulies go to Hollywood to help Daffy, and nothing resembling hilarity ensues. In fact, the first part of the special is just them watching Daffy's movie. From a purely theoretical character standpoint, I can almost buy the first 5 minutes of this being so god-awful, because the plot dictates that it's a movie directed by Daffy. Then again, Daffy would have directed The Scarlet Pumpernickel, so, that would have been great. So, Withdrawn.
So, withdrawn.
Now, earlier I talked about how because certain voices that Mel did for Warner's were pitched up, that when other studios produced stuff with those characters, they could potentially get it wrong.
Well, without this, the only way I'd get any attention is by saying, that's all, folks. Well, without this, the only way I'd get any attention is by saying, that's all, folks.
Well, nowhere is that more evident than in this special. I mean, Filmation gets most things wrong anyway, and nowhere is that more apparent than when they try to recreate classic cartoon characters. And Daffy, Tweety, and Porky's voices in this are no exception. Daffy sounds like Woody Woodpecker.
All right, cut. That's the print. We're ready for the stuntmen now. Bring them out.
Porky's not pitched at all and just sounds like Mel Blanc stuttering.
If the stuntmen aren't here yet, Daffy.
And Tweety is practically subharmonic. It's so annoying that someone on YouTube actually took the time to digitally fix it. Like that would somehow make this disaster work.
All right, cut. That's the print. We're ready for the stuntmen now. Bring them out.
If the stuntmen aren't here yet, Daffy.
Not here?
The pitch-perfect formula for Daffy and Porky has always been 3 semitones up. But if you think Daffy and Sylvester are the same voice because it's Mel Blanc lisping, then you couldn't be more wrong. Greg Ford said that when making Daffy Duck's Quackbusters, he mistook Daffy's voice for Sylvester's, and then said, what's the difference? Mel reportedly corrected him, insisting, Sylvester's a genteel, Daffy's a Jew. I wonder if there's anything to that.
Anchoring for trouble, eh? Well, I would like a trip to Europe. I would like to introduce myself.
Anyway, there is definitely a different performance. Whether or not it's a Jew versus a non-Jew is anybody's guess, but if we take the only scene from the classic theatrical shorts where Daffy and Sylvester are in a cartoon and talk to each other, the before-mentioned Scarlet Pumpernickel, and apply a digital 3 semitone boost or drop, depending who we do it to, we can indeed hear a different performance for Sylvester and Daffy.
Milady the fair Melissa is indisposed, my lord?
No, your grace, but she wishes to see no one until after the wedding.
Milady the fair Melissa is indisposed, my lord?
No, your grace, but she wishes to see no one until after the wedding.
So here now is that scene with Daffy's voice pitched down to sound like the original recording that Mel did, while talking to Sylvester, who was never pitched at all.
The wedding must take place tonight, my lord. The Scarlet Pumpernickel is about, masquerading as a gentleman. And who might you be? Era, mayhap perchance, foppish that I am, I might be the Scarlet Pumpernickel? You, the Scarlet Pumpernickel?
And now here's Daffy, as pitched in the original cartoon, talking to Sylvester, who is boosted now 3 semitones up.
The wedding must take place tonight, my lord. The Scarlet Pumpernickel is about, masquerading as a gentleman. And who might you be? Era, mayhap perchance, foppish that I am, I might be the Scarlet Pumpernickel? You, the Scarlet Pumpernickel? That's silly. That's ridiculous.
That's weird, isn't it? Sylvester doesn't become Daffy when you pitch him up 3 semitones, and Daffy doesn't become Sylvester when you bring him down by the same amount. Mel Blanc is a consummate actor first, folks, and we just proved it with technology. Modern design.
Modern design! Woohoo!
Anyway, in addition to Filmation screwing up the pitch of the original voices, they also screw up the tone of the original WB shorts because they added a f***ing laugh track. That's how literal-minded the heads of production were at Filmation. The heads of television, really. The first season of The Flintstones was genius, and it did really well, but it was a parody of, once again, The Honeymooners. And because The Honeymooners was a sitcom, the cartoonists at Hanna-Barbera cleverly put a laugh track over The Flintstones, which makes sense.
Oh, gee. If I'd have known that's all there was to getting a baby, I'd have wished on a fallen star long ago. Hey, Betty!
But with that show being Hanna-Barbera's first really big success, the Hollywood copycat theory is placed on everything. They do it on several shows, and then almost a full decade later, it's being done ad nauseum at a different studio that doesn't even know why the original studio did it in the first place. Of course, all the blame can't be put on Filmation. This thing was written by Len Jansen and Chuck Menville, a writing and story editing team that were, as early as 1972 when this thing was made, highly regarded as solid professionals, in that they could deliver the edicts of studio heads with no creative abilities and communicate with the artists that would otherwise be running things in the days of classic animation.
What a great idea for a gag!
Heading fire.
Jansen and Menville made a lot of money from the 60s through the 80s at every animation studio at Hollywood. And in a town that favors quantity over quality every time, they were considered money in the bank because they had a lot of shit in their wake, all of it cheap and worth its weight in hay pennies. One of their greatest crimes in animation history is the real Ghostbusters. Essentially, they were hired to do a job, but the job in question was to deliberately ruin the series to answer to studio focus group testing that was never actually tested. Now, I can't speak nearly as intelligently about this affront to the animated version of a perfect comedy, but others have, so for more on that, go to Phalus's page. He's the man. And I sincerely hope he talks like that in real life.
I hate with a passion the Dave Coulier Peter Bankman!
Now, as I said before, Roger Rabbit wasn't the only thing that kick-started the animation resurgence in the late 80s that essentially killed Jansen and Menville's career of blanding everything.
Oh no! It's the real Gagbusters!
Yes, it's the real Gagbusters. 4 totally off-the-wall characters sworn to eliminate any trace of humor in the world today.
Hey, look, these guys are telling jokes. They're not supposed to do that. Yeah, next thing you know, people will start laughing at them. We gotta stop them, okay? But how? Oh, I know. Let's select them out with extreme prejudice.
Seriously, their stuff was lacking in imagination, humor, and creativity. Everything that was the opposite of Ralph Bakshi's Mighty Mouse. In fact, the writers of that show, John Kricfalusi, Tom Minton, Jim Reardon, Andrew Stanton, those guys stood against that shit, and it led to the first funny cartoon on television in over 20 years.
The whole idea of that was we're going to look at all these different cartoons that are on Saturday mornings and lambaste them.
Now, obviously, Menville and Jansen didn't write everything on Saturday morning, but their success set the tone, and people who didn't employ their technique were soon out of work. Now, with these two guys being a monument to bland writing and hackneyed premises in, of all things, children's entertainment, you'd think for sure they were never artists themselves, right? I mean, once a hack, always a hack, right? Well, check out this independent short that they did earlier on in their career while still working at Disney's. This is Stop, Look, and Listen, one of Jansen and Menville's first independent stop-motion films, and it's really f***ing cool. It has a plot, it's funny, well-made, and has a tremendous understanding of movement in space that only competent animators could understand. It also stars several cartoonists of the day who then worked at Disney's and other studios. They edited the sound at Disney's, then they took it to MGM, who bought it and released it. Look it up on YouTube, it's really cool. And if nothing else, it shows how two guys with genuine creative potential were eventually assimilated into a system which had gone degenerate and turned into functioning hacks. Then again, I don't know. Maybe I have them all wrong, and maybe they regret what they did. Clip.
And we were pretty much hogtied in a lot of ways by broadcast standards.
Well, we saw the new Janine there.
You know, I liked her the other way. It kind of gave her a little edge.
Right.
And now she's, she looks like typical housewife. Nothing against housewives, but Janine's character was kind of an edgy Brooklynite, you know?
Right.
And that's what made her different.
Either way, Jansen and Menville wrote Daffy Duck and Porky Pig Meet the Groovy Ghoulies. Inadequately named, I might add, because Porky doesn't meet them any more so than any of the other characters, least of all Daffy. Chuck and Len wrote it, and it's crap. And that's keeping in form with the norm because they wrote a lot of crap, and Filmation was the studio that hired them, which is apt because they're a studio that made nothing but crap. So what have we learned from all this? Well, I Number 1, a political cartoon.
Could you go over there and put another dime in the dryer?
This one is, hands down, the most obscure non-Warner Brothers Mel Blanc Looney Tunes performance. He said, desperate to wedge his overly long titles into seemingly casual conversation that was clearly written. But yeah, obscure like a mother. I mean, you never heard of it, right? I only found out about it a few months ago. And it's such that, unlike Roger Rabbit, number 5 on this list, I have to actually explain to you what it is. A political cartoon produced in 1974, 2 years after that awful Filmation venture, is a live-action short with what I guess passes for animation in the non-Bugs Bunny scenes, which, by the way, there are only 2, about a businessman who meets a cartoonist who has the ability to bring whatever he draws on his easel to life. So they make a president.
Make a president!
So the title implies that they're going for satire, but as Trey Parker and Matt Stone recently confessed, we are finally at the point where satire has become the reality. And just like in this case, the story ends with the cartoonist and his producer not knowing how to deal with this manufactured cartoon that they created and made a president. Stop it! Stop it! Hey, no. That joke is too easy, even for me. Toward the end, the president gets too costly to keep animating, so they reuse old drawings in an attempt to make a jab at crappy animation studios of the day. Like Filmation.
Did you ever try any animated cartoons?
Oh yeah, I've done that. But it's so discouraging. Networks aren't willing to spend any money on animated cartoons anymore. Nowadays, all they care about is having as little movement as possible. Well, they had me working for 3 years on a series that took place in a home for crippled ventriloquists.
Hi-ho! What do you say, Bungo?
Hoop-de-doo! Everything's okay by me, Bingo!
Dasher Rudy! It's okay by me too, Bungo!
Hi-ho the Dario! That's swell, Bingo!
Yeah!
Whoopee! Yay! Woo!
And that's something I can buy into because I know who made this movie. A guy named Joe Adamson, a man who knows so much about Tex Avery, the king of cartoons, that he wrote a book about it. Tex Avery, King of Cartoons. Adamson knows all too well, and certainly did in the dark times of animation, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that good cartoons are costly. So I know this sentiment in the film is an honest one. But here's the problem. Apart from the 2 Bugs Bunny scenes, animated by the brilliant Mark Kausler, the animation is pretty terrible. So when it gets to the part of the movie where they have to reuse drawings and the animation is supposed to be shitty, they have to hold on the drawings longer just to make it register visually that it's deliberately shitty now. Alright, enough tangents. Let's get to why this is on the list. The Bugs Bunny segments. Oh, to hell with it. They're so quick. Let's just play them in their entirety anyway. The first one is right at the beginning of the movie. Let's watch.
Hi, friends. This is Bugs Bunny, reminding you that fantasy is everybody's business.
Paid for by Suffering Succotash, Washington, D.C.
And then the credits start. So the next one is in the middle of the film, and it's at a part in the story where people are having negative reactions to cartoons because of the president, and one of them says that Bugs Bunny's been put into the zoo.
Has the media picked up on this yet? Bugs Bunny was interviewed on the news last night.
Now, sir, How did you feel when you were put on sale here in this pet store?
What?
How did you feel when you were put on sale here in this pet store?
How do you feel interviewing a rabbit?
The joke in the original script was that Bugs was old and living in a retirement home for cartoon stars. His dialogue reportedly would have been, "Hey, will you send me a couple of carrots? They won't let me have them anymore. Wrap them up, make them look like cigars or something." That animation is something else, man. First of all, it's all done by Mark Kausler about 4 years after he graduated from Schoenart Art School, the first winner of the Bob Cannon Scholarship, and you can tell he was pretty much on his own with this. He probably had to paint the backgrounds himself, too. The drawings are very good, but the movement isn't timed very well, mainly because if you're doing classic animation, that's the director's job. One thing I was struck with at first is that the color is all wrong, and at first I chalked this up to the fact that, the Bugs Bunny cartoons aren't readily available in 1973, but then I saw these. These are cells from the sequences in the intro and at the zoo. Look at those colors. Those are Bugs's colors exactly. Or at least as they were in the 40s, which is the style he was emulating. In fact, that got him some criticism from Chuck Jones and Bob McKimson, who doubtlessly wanted their more current version of Bugs to be used. But ironically, the model sheet that Kausler used to animate from had been drawn by McKimson. Also interesting to note that Mel Blanc recorded these vocals right here.
Hi, friends. This is Bugs Bunny.
In a hospital with a broken leg. That's right, folks. When Bugs says this,
"Fantasy is everybody's business,"
Mel was propped up, given a script and a check for $300, and he did it while on 1973 model pain meds. I'd say mic drop, but he doesn't even drop his own mic. That's how baller Mel Blanc is, you guys. People come into his hospital bed, set it up, record him, pay him, drop the mic in order to celebrate in Mel's astounding awesomeness, and then get fired for needlessly breaking expensive audio equipment. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed this video about the times where Mel Blanc did the Looney Tunes voices unofficially but still awesomely. I'm Trevor Thompson, the self-appointed Looney Tunes critic, and until next time, that's all, folks.